One of the year's most acclaimed films has vaping Italians, bombs, and a pool full of turtles. It's also a thinly veiled allegory about the 2024 election, and it's making some lose their minds.
So Catholics all over the world should be extraordinarily pissed at this movie.
In Conclave, the hunt for a new pope gives us a standoff between a bombastic populist with fascist tendencies and a polite liberal whose campaign pitch is basically that the other guy is worse. Meanwhile, an outsider candidate who stands with the marginalized waits on the sidelines. Now some, like our buddy Ben Shapiro, found the film offensive.
A form of liberation theology, far left social policy gobbledygook. That's what this movie's about.
Now, others see it as critiquing modern fascism in both its political and religious forms, and for others, it's basically just Gossip Girl set at the Vatican. But we think that the most interesting aspect of the film is how it questions the certainties that underlie modern politics and religion. And in doing this, Conclave critiques our reliance on traditional institutions and presents a theory of truth that can help destabilize a society that's grown old and stale. Now, you may not expect it from a movie about geriatric Catholics, but Conclave asks us to embrace the uncertainty of the future over the certainty of the past.
La iglesia es lo que hagamos en adelante.
And it sheds light on an election that many of us are still trying to make sense of. Though it's all complicated by the radical critique happening within the very rigid and un-radical institution of the Catholic Church. In case anyone's gonna say in the comments, like, we get it that the Catholic Church does and has done bad stuff. Like, we get it. The movie kinda gets it. So just so you know, we know. You know, I've seen Spotlight. I've read stuff. I've seen things. I get it, okay? Don't worry about it. So let's see what radical political lessons we can learn from a bunch of robed up espresso sipping priests. So, after the Pope dies, second in command Cardinal Lawrence, played by Ralph Fiennes, has to lead a conclave where all the cardinals get locked inside the Vatican with no access to the outside world until they pick a new pope. The stakes mirror those of the 2024 US presidential election. We got traditional values versus progressive liberalism, inclusivity versus strict identitarian boundaries, culture war versus culture of tolerance, vape God versus Tucci. Now, one of the most crucial moments comes during the opening homily given by Cardinal Lawrence.
To work together, to grow together, we must be tolerant. No one person or faction seeking to dominate another.
Lawrence goes on to laud the church for its diversity, which he identifies as the very source of its strength. But controversially, he identifies what he believes to be the church's greatest sin. It's not the covering up of sex abuse, in case you thought that's what it was going to be.
Certainty is the great enemy of unity. Certainty is the deadly enemy of tolerance.
Now, this is a contradiction to some of the members of this conclave who see their faith and certainty as two sides of the same coin. Now, whether that certainty is the truth of tradition or a belief that certain people matter less to God because of their specific interpretation of the Bible.
Adeyemi has the wind behind him.
Adeyemi. Adeyemi, the man who believes that homosexuals should be sent to prison in this world and hell in the next.
For a tradition oriented around the certainty that God exists, it's actually a pretty radical challenge for some. Now, Lawrence goes on.
If there was only certainty and no doubt, there would be no mystery and therefore no need for faith.
If doubt is an inherent part of faith, then truth and certainty are incompatible, because I can't doubt that which I know to be objectively certain. And when Lawrence says faith is a living thing, he's veering close to an existentialist understanding of truth, in which truth is something that we do more than it is something we merely believe in or agree with. He seems to be calling out both the conservative and liberal camps of the Vatican, as both have turned matters of faith into a scheming political competition, meeting in dark hallways to whip votes. And the allusion to our own political system is not subtle. The two political camps in the Vatican are a very clear stand-in for the two dominant political parties in America. And Lawrence's homily points to the way in which contemporary elections honestly just feel like two competing camps, which both have a radical certainty that they have exclusive access to the truth. Now, against this, Lawrence is prioritizing doubt.
Let us pray that God will grant us a pope who doubts, and let him grant us a pope who sins and asks for forgiveness and who carries on.
This scene lays out a theory of truth that we can use to interpret both the film and the message the film is offering to contemporary discourse. This conception of truth is one in which certainty isn't a sign of faith, but a sign of the lack of faith, and one in which our beliefs are held in fear and trembling, as we're always aware that things could be otherwise. You know, for example, by holding on to certainty, we're able to dismiss legitimate challenges and concerns that might change our beliefs. In this way, it's more like fanaticism than it is faith. Paradoxically, certainty often hides an insecurity that if one's beliefs are challenged, they might not hold up, while uncertainty indicates the ability to reevaluate ideas without losing your hold on reality. Now, for those both in the film and in our culture, the notion of truth being associated with any type of uncertainty or potential relativism undermines classical moral values and traditions.
Senza Roma, senza la tradizione di Roma, things fall apart.
Cardinal Tedesco and co. worry that without rigid and absolute traditions, well, we're just paving the way for chaos and relativism, one which leads to the type of political unrest we learn is happening outside the walls of the Vatican.
There's been an explosion around in the Piazza Barberini.
It's also wild how the moment that Lawrence caves into the earthly politics of the Pope election, God throws a bomb through the window to punish him. God's crazy like that sometimes. You think he's gonna zig, and he zags with a bomb. Which is why Tedesco reacts so intensely after the attack that burst through the barriers of the Conclave.
Ecco, finalmente qui vediamo il risultato della dottrina del relativismo, tanto cara ai nostri fratelli liberali. Se guardiamo la patria della nostra Santa Madre Romana Chiesa, noi la vediamo ormai punteggiata da minareti, moschee, del profeta Maometto.
For Tedesco and other dudes whose names start with T, believing that all faiths, all nations, all people are inherently equal leads to the destruction of that which is traditional and true. In accepting others, well, they're destroying their own faith and their own values. To acknowledge that Muslims can live a good and legitimate life via their faith is to imply that your faith is not singularly true. Now, the next lines of Tedesco's speech were particularly on the nose, at least when I saw this film, because it was 2 days after the election.
No, noi quello di cui abbiamo bisogno è un capo. Capisca che ci troviamo di fronte ad una vera guerra di religione. Noi abbiamo bisogno di un capo che ponga fine alla deriva che dura incessantemente da 50 anni. Quanto tempo dovremo stare ancora in questa debolezza? Quanto? Noi abbiamo bisogno di un capo who fights these animals.
When you're certain of what's true, you get to be certain over who counts as human and who can be disregarded as animals.
They're poisoning the blood of our country.
Now, the Vaped Pope's position is actually really similar to the very un-Catholic Soren Kierkegaard's idea of the church triumphant. Now, this is a type of church grounded in objective certainty towards its object of theological truth, in which the knowledge of God takes on an objective form. Now, according to this type of church, Christendom simply is, rather than existing in a process of active becoming. Truth is already settled, not something that's active or potentially uncertain. The believer is 100% confident in their beliefs. And this sort of thinking leads to a desire to win, or even to go to war over the certainty of one's faith.
This is a conclave, Aldo. It's not a war.
It is a war, and you have to commit to a side.
Tedesco's triumphant and militaristic call to action is met by the humility of Benitez.
With respect, what do you know about war? When you say we have to fight, what is it you think we're fighting? La lucha está aquí. Aquí.
While Tedesco's attitude leads him to want to lash out at external forces, Benitez calls for him to look inward, into his own heart. Now, Kierkegaard offers a prayer that seems like it could come from Benitez himself. He writes, "Keep us also from this, that we delude ourselves into thinking ourselves to be members of a church already triumphant here in this world." Against the triumphant church, Kierkegaard offers what he calls the church militant, which believes that Christ is the truth in the sense that to be the truth is the only true explanation of what truth is. It's basically an existentialist understanding of truth, right? In which the true is something that you do, not merely something that you casually believe or agree with. Because you can agree that 2 + 2 = 4 without there being any radical existential commitment on your part. But let's say I make a claim like racism is inherently evil. It is, but then I participate in or even encourage racist ideologies. If I do that, then it's not true for me, right? Because something's only true if it shapes my course of action, if it shapes my own subjectivity. So while Tedesco wants to defend the truth against the animals outside the gates, Benitez calls for his fellow cardinals to be the truth in terms of how they approach the world around them.
Y perdónenme, pero en estos días hemos demostrado ser un grupo de hombres pequeños y mezquinos, interesados solamente en nosotros mismos, en Roma, en la elección y el poder. Y esas cosas no son la iglesia. La iglesia no es la tradición. La iglesia no es el pasado. La iglesia es lo que hagamos en adelante.
Kierkegaard writes that truth is obviously not to know the truth, but to be the truth. And here, Benitez describes the church in similar terms, as something in the process of becoming, not an institution that already is, Because in the triumphant church, you already won, even if not everyone realizes it, so there isn't that much to do other than agree that you won, you're the winner, where over in the militant church, there's this emphasis on constantly becoming itself and yourself and working out the truth of foundational beliefs. And here we got a little bit of a spoiler alert. This speech ends up winning Benitez the papacy. The papacy is what you call the office of the Pope. In case you don't know Pope stuff. I happen to know Pope stuff because I grew up Catholic, pay attention to things. But if you don't know Pope stuff, totally fine. Another fun Pope fact, if you don't know this is from our new series coming out, #PopeFacts. When you become Pope, you get to change your name, have a whole new name. It's kind of fun, right? Do you ever think that we should have points in our life where we can change our name if we want, if we feel like, I've been this for a while, let's try something new? If you've been wanting to do that, we encourage it, and if you want to legally change your name and you let us pick your new middle name, we will pay the legal fees. Let us know in the comments. It's sort of like if during the 2016 Trump versus Clinton election, Bernie Sanders gave a speech that was so sick that he ended up just winning the popular vote by a landslide. That would have been cool, probably. But we don't get to live in that timeline because of our sin. But this message might be undercut by the fact that it's all taking place within the walls of the Catholic Church, a rigid institution that for most of its history has claimed ownership over theological truth while at the same time being complicit in sexual abuse scandals. I think like other scandals too, I think they've done a lot of weird and bad stuff. That's the most recent one, But if there's other Catholic scandals you want to talk about, let us know in the comments. That's a fun thing to chat about. It's an institution that is more triumphant than it is militant.
Spondio, dobio accioro, sic me Deus aduvet, et xanta Dei evangelia, que mano mea tango.
The only women in the film are nuns who sort of just float in the background with the exception of Isabella Rossellini's sister Agnes.
Although we sisters are supposed to be invisible, God has nevertheless given us eyes and ears.
And having sex in the past is enough to ruin Nigerian priest Adeyemi's run for the papacy.
After such a public scene, there will be rumors, and you know what the curia is like.
Though they sort of shrug their shoulders at him being a deadbeat dad, and wanting to send gay people to hell. That's kind of like a to some of these priests. And the film points to the church's irrelevance to society by showing us that while acts of terrorism are taking place outside, the priests are just inside in their robes, drinking espresso, arguing about who gets to be the biggest man in the clubhouse. Now, while the film's message, which we see in Cardinal Lawrence's homily, models Kierkegaard's church militant, it's all happening within an institution that in many ways represents Kierkegaard's church triumphant. And this can remind us of politicians in Washington arguing over tax credits and trade tariffs and if Elon Musk can become the Speaker of the House, while in the rest of the country, for most folks, we're just concerned with how we're going to pay for our health insurance. And just as both Tedesco and Bellini represent two sides of the triumphant model of the church, conservatives and liberals in American politics both represent one overarching system. And by that I mean that while politicians and parties will squabble over specific policy agendas, most seem to agree that the whole American experiment is good and doesn't need to be questioned in a fundamental way. It's like when Barack Obama tried to shame young and black voters into supporting Kamala Harris rather than acknowledging the legitimacy of their broader concerns. Just as neither Tedesco or Bellini seem to want to question the underlying structures of the church that they so fiercely support, politicians are rarely going to question underlying economic and social structures that they tacitly help maintain. It's like when genuinely progressive politicians like Elizabeth Warren will speak out about fighting against economic inequality and then introduce policies to help them that boil down to let's do capitalism, but in a more fair way. In both cases, seemingly competing accounts of truth are contained within one overarching system with very clear and rigid boundaries. And no matter who becomes the Pope, they're still going to be contained in the history and ideology of the Catholic Church. And no matter who has power in the American government, they're still constrained by a very specific system. Philosopher Alain Badiou talks about this in his own discussion of truth, in which truths create situations in which they exist. So for example, the truth of Catholicism creates the situation of the Catholic Church. The truth of the American Revolution and the Constitution creates the situation of the United States government. The systems in which we live are structured around foundational truths. which demand that we at least tacitly accept those truths to sort of get on in society. This means that within these systems, we don't really get radical new truths, but slight reform within a situation that already exists. You know, as a great American Catholic president once said,
"Nothing will fundamentally change."
For Badiou, something that's true fundamentally breaks apart an existing situation and then creates something new. And in a similar way to Kierkegaard's discussion of the church triumphant and the church militant, Badiou notes that these truths don't just create settled new situations. They create whole new types of existence where we have to appropriate and live out these truths for ourselves. For example, I've said it a bunch, I'll say it again, religion isn't something that you believe, it's something that you do. In this way, truth is less an idea that we agree or disagree with than a way of life that we commit to despite our own doubts and uncertainties. And this all brings us to the film's surprising, if heavy-handed conclusion, in which we learn that Benitez, now Pope Innocent, is in fact intersex.
What would it have been, this treatment?
It was called a laparoscopic hysterectomy.
Some critics have found this last-minute reveal to be a bit much. And it's clear that this reveal is going to be hidden in the halls of the Vatican and won't actually affect his papacy in any external way. But I still find it interesting because in doing so, this makes material the type of truth being discussed in the film. You know, if true faith involves the embrace of uncertainty, then Benitez represents this uncertainty in terms of his own biology. And just like the Bible refers to Christ as the Word made flesh, the film tries to use Benitez to make uncertainty flesh.
Perhaps it is my difference that would make me more useful. I think again of your sermon. I know what it is to exist between the world's certainties.
But there's still a huge gap between acknowledging the truth of this biological instability and affirming it as something good and true. By presumably hiding it within the rituals of the papacy, nothing will fundamentally change about the structures of the Vatican. You know, the newly anointed Pope Innocent's uncertain gender identity isn't going to upset the strict theological identity of the Catholic Church. You know, it's like how having a black congressman in 1870 didn't exactly slow down Jim Crow, or like how folks initially celebrated the queer identity of Senator Kyrsten Sinema, only to then watch her spend 6 years standing in the way of all types of radical legislation that would help working and vulnerable Americans, and then she even worked against potential legal protections for LGBTQ+ Americans. Although she looked cool while doing it though, so you know, that's what it's all about. As John Hackett writes in his review of this movie, if the message is that the church can modernize through egalitarian recruitment, surely this overlooks the fact that the church is a deeply entrenched, hierarchical, patriarchal institution. This ending also avoids the more radical potential of Kierkegaard's militant church model or Badiou's model of truth, both of which involve a fundamental uncertainty which makes something radically new possible. Maybe the ultimate takeaway from this film is that radical change will never happen within rigid and triumphant systems. And the fundamental tension of the film is that it wants to say something symbolically significant, but not enough that it would actually fundamentally challenge the systems and institutions it's critiquing. Kind of like when Nancy Pelosi and her fellow Democrats stood with Black lives by kneeling in kente cloths. Spoiler alert, that did not end racism or police violence. But hey, let us know what you think about this movie in the comments. Reminder that we have our own movie podcast that's called Show Me the Meaning. It streams right here every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Pacific, and after the fact, you can watch it here or listen to it on your favorite podcasting app. So check that out. In the meantime, take it easy, and we'll be back with more takes for you in a couple weeks.